People change.
I hated math. I didn't study
Really?
economy or finance that my parents wanted because I didn't want to take any class of math.
Ah.
Today I teach math in high school.
Look where you got.
Wow.
You can't run from your destiny.
That's right. That's right.
Your destiny was in the numbers.
Yeah, but in the growth path.
Ah. Well, you know, sometimes the long road is actually the shortest.
That's why I praying for a few more hours.
Ah.
What's happening with the numbers?
You mean the lottery numbers?
Yes.
All right. So,
What?
Of course.
Of course, we did. Yeah, we did too. I figured with your statistics, you were busy picking numbers there.
No, randomly, but
Nah.
the option that you,
there are no,
It doesn't-
there's
doesn't
no
matter.
formula that can possibly
No
predict that.
yeah, it doesn't matter.
If there was, someone would have already found it.
Okay.
Well, there was that one guy who was secretly feeding the numbers into the thing. It was in the Midwest or something. And he was rigging the system. And he kept winning or having friends win. And they finally caught him. It's like, wait a minute. You know, you can only go so far before they notice.
Well, there are
Oh,
those who say they're inflating the balls in different ways so that they're rigging this one. I've read that.
to favor number 4?
No, to favor those numbers that nobody picked so that nobody will win.
It's
So
random.
they can keep doing, well, no.
No, I mean, most of the people who pick numbers are random. Anyway,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
Okay.
Not random. How's that for a segue? Not random is the holiday of Pesach, right? Because every year the holiday of Pesach comes on the day of, what's our date? The Hebrew date. What?
14th
14th.
Nisan. Nisan.
Officially, what time? The 15th. Okay. All right. Remember,
Is the eve.
exactly right. Right. So every year Passover begins on the 15th of Nisan, not a car company, right? The 15th of Nisan, which means, as we talked about for the last few weeks, right? The 14th is very special, right? The 14th has all sorts of special requirements. You have to prepare for you have to do the biur chametz, the getting rid of your chametz, the destruction of it. Usually done by fire now. We talked about some of the other ways you can do it. The
No
night
work, right?
and they had all the restrictions on work, exactly right, kind of depending upon the time, depending upon where you lived and what the custom was, exactly. But of course, the big job on the 14th is
The sacrifice.
the sacrifice. Exactly right. Phew, I was going to cut my throat. Get it? Cut my
Oh,
throat.
cut my
Sacrifice.
throat.
Anyway, that's why I'm not a comedian. See, I didn't become a comedian. I became a rabbi. You became a math teacher rather than an accountant. The big issue on the 14th is the sacrifice. And we talked a lot about how that sacrifice went in last week's class. We're up to speed? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. But there's a question mark that we're going to go into more detail, which is, I need a new pen. Let me see if blue works better. What happens if the 14th
It's Shabbat.
is Shabbat?
Like this year.
No.
No,
No,
this, no,
second
14
day.
is Friday.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, so the 14th is Friday this year. And if we were living in the land of Israel, that would all be the only thing we had to worry about. And since we're talking about the temple times, we're not going to go into first day, second day Chag issues. So what happens if the 14th is Shabbat? We talked a little bit.
We spoke like you continue doing the sacrifices and everything.
You continue doing the sacrifices and everything. It's the everything that we're now going to deal with.
Okay.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. Last week we talked all about you do the sacrifices, and we talked about the different issues of the poles. Remember, and now the arms between two guys
Yeah,
while
the
you're
mitzvah preceded the Shabbat.
okay.
That's good.
But that's the sacrifice. What about the everything? That's what we're going to get into in chapter 6. Right? Is what happens when it's overlapping here. And the sacrifice, okay, we kind of sort of know what we can do on Shabbat for that sacrifice, but what about the rest? And remember, it's because the festival isn't starting till the 15th, right? So the 14th is pure Shabbat. It's not Shabbat plus festival. It's pure Shabbat. And it just happens to be the day before a major festival. So let's wrestle. And we're going to get some very interesting parts in chapter 6. I know we're going to get to at least one Mishnah that's fascinating, and another one that's similar we might get to tonight. We'll see how we go. But the second Mishnah is going to be really very interesting for you to wrestle with, because it's one of the few Mishnahs that has what we call Shakla Vataria. the give and take of rabbinic debate. Of one rabbi says this, and another rabbi doesn't make a different statement, but responds. They challenge each other, right? Usually that's only in the Talmud, right? The Talmud is full of that. The Talmud is, Rabbi A says, that he believes X, and Rabbi B says, but you can't believe X because of Y. And it's back and forth like that. You don't get that often in the Mishnah. So it's a rare opportunity.
And will any of these restrictions have an impact on what I could do on if the first day of Pesach is on Sunday? I have preparations to do on Shabbat. Are they those I'm allowed to do and those I'm not?
No.
I'm not. I have
I don't want to, spoiler alert.
Right.
The end of our debate is going to be very, very clear that the only things that are allowed to be done on Shabbat are going to be the most intimately connected to the actual mitzvah of the sacrifice, which has to be done the day before Pesach begins.
Okay, so I don't have to clean the chametz out of my house a day earlier.
Absolutely. So everything else, because we live in non-temple times without the sacrifice, all of the regular preparations, you're cooking for Pesach Seder, that's all has to happen before Shabbat. Well, the cooking technically you can do after Shabbat. It just means you're going to have a really late Seder. But yeah, Shabbat is 100% Shabbat in the modern world. And so you can't say, well, kind of, sort of, it's almost Passover, so I can break Shabbat. Nope. No. In the modern world, there's no exceptions for Pesach. Obviously, we've talked before, lots of things, saving life, etc. But when it comes to Passover, in the modern world, there's no reason why you should have to break Shabbat to celebrate Passover. Okay, chapter 6, Mishnah 1. We're getting into the Shabbat issue. Okay, Harry, you look like you're ready to go.
I'm ready. 1, these things in connection with the Pesach override Shabbat.
Remember again, the Pesach, we're talking about the sacrifice.
Its slaughtering and the sprinkling of its blood and the cleansing of its innards and the burning of its fat.
Okay, so remember we talked about this detail last week, right? The actual slaughter, the across the throat, the blood that was carried in those basins, remember, up the chain line and being sprinkled upon the altar, right? Now, all of that, you would not kill an animal on a regular Shabbat. You would not put blood, do anything with its blood if you had a dead animal on Shabbat. And the washing of the insides and the taking of the fat that is used on the altar, you wouldn't do that on a regular Shabbat.
They didn't do sacrifices on Shabbat?
Other sacrifices, yes.
Yes.
But if I'm your run-of-the-mill Jew and I'm not there for the Tamid sacrifice, I'm not part of the Kohen's daily required mitzvah sacrifice, I'm bringing a sin offering or I'm bringing a well-being offering, I don't do that on Shabbat. Right? Because my voluntary sacrifice doesn't trump Shabbat. But this isn't voluntary.
Is there any other sacrifice that is over Shabbat?
On a
Yom Kippur, no? Also sacrificing.
Right, but those aren't individual sacrifices. Those are community sacrifices. Right? It's not my choice to bring a Yom Kippur sacrifice, and I don't have an obligation as Mr. It's a community, exactly. The only one that's kind of sort of is the Kohen Gadol has to do special sacrifices, but he's representing everything. So it's kind of sort of like that. But for all the other sacrifices, there is no, let me put it this way, there's no other holiday where you're required to bring a sacrifice exactly on the day that might be Shabbat, that then you have this issue. Okay, so all of those things that are connected to the sacrifice, they trump Shabbat. You go ahead and do it. You normally wouldn't, but because the 14th is going to be for Passover, even if it's Shabbat, these things you can do. But
its roasting and the washing of its innards do not override Shabbat.
All right, so you got your animal dead. You have sprinkled the blood. You have cleaned out the insides and gotten the fat burned on the altar. You do not get to take it home immediately and start cooking it. You have to wait until Motzei Shabbat, until Havdalah, until Shabbat is over, and then you can start cooking your lamb. Yeah, he's already beginning to count. Wait, how long am I going to be waiting before I get to eat then?
No, but in this way, also you don't enjoy Shabbat. You don't do only Shabbat because you are thinking about all this and really and everything what you need to do after Shabbat. So in some way you are going against the spirit of the Shabbat.
An excellent argument, and no. So I mean, there's always the argument of, I if I don't write down the address that so-and-so just told me, I'm going to be worrying about forgetting it for the whole rest of Shabbat. So isn't it better for me just to write it down now, and then I don't have to worry about it? It's just a few letters.
Right.
No, we can always convince ourselves that I'm too worried to keep Shabbat, and so I should go ahead and break it. And this is saying, even for Pesach, the actual sacrifice, which has to be done on the 14th, it's how it's commanded, right? Do it on the 14th. That you have to observe or have to break Shabbat for the sacrificial parts, but you don't break Shabbat for anything else that could be delayed, or as we'll also see, done earlier before Shabbat. It's just, you don't get to do it. And in particular, they go ahead and add on the question.
Carrying it and bringing it from outside the Shabbat border and cutting off its wart do not override Shabbat.
Right, so you're not allowed to carry it in on Shabbat, which means you better be inside the borders of Jerusalem before Shabbat begins, and you are not allowed to remove, they call it a wart, it's a skin blemish that can be removed from the animal that would make it okay for a sacrifice, but if you didn't cut it off, it wouldn't be okay for a sacrifice. So you were waiting there to go up, and oh, right, it's got that wart. I was supposed to cut that off.
So,
Sorry.
Too bad.
So
Too bad.
Too bad.
the whole city of Jerusalem was a big Eruv, or
Right.
only the high temple.
No, the walled part of the city was an Eruv.
So you could you cook and do everything if your family is inside the city.
You're not
No
cooking.
cook,
You're not cooking.
no cooking.
Not on
Okay,
Shabbat.
but you can carry it home
Yes.
and you can cut
Ah,
a part and everything.
No, you cannot cut.
No.
Not the wart.
No.
Right, the cutting of the wart is not part of the mitzvah. The cutting of the wart is preparation before doing the mitzvah. And that's preparation that should have happened before Shabbat began.
Okay, so you only can carry it home if your family is inside the city.
You can only, let me make it a little bit bigger. You can only carry it home if it's not breaking Shabbat.
But if the whole city,
Well, but I want to make
The
sure
wall
that,
is
but that's
decided
why it's okay,
Eruv.
right? It's only because in Jerusalem there was a special circumstance where yes, the whole town was covered as being considered a shared domain, what we call an eruv, and then yes, that would be okay. But that's only because it's considered an eruv. It's not because it's okay to carry it on
No, of
Shabbat.
course.
Well, I'm just making sure that the big rule here is the very, very narrowest definition of what is needed for the sacrifice, that trumps Shabbat. All of the, as you put it, and everything, when we first began, that doesn't trump Shabbat, right? And that's the argument here. And now the expanded argument is going to be, really? Well, what about the kind of sort of borderline everything issues? And that's going to be our Mishnah 2. Okay, so Mishnah 2, and why don't we go ahead? I'll explain things as we go through it. But what I want to make sure we understand, we've talked about it before, but always good repeat. Remember that in general, in rabbinic, in the rabbis' discussions of prohibitions or any mitzvah, they talk about deoraita and derabanan. That is to say, they talk about commandments that are linked undeniably and transparently from the Torah itself, and derabanan, which are enactments by the rabbis, the rabbanan, in order to make sure that the Torah is observed properly. But the rabbis don't claim that it is directly 100% undeniably there. They are deliberately putting the packing material around the Torah, right? They are
Defense.
the offense, exactly. This
Would an example of that be, for instance, the Torah says, observe Shabbat, remember Shabbat,
Mhm.
but the rabbis say, do it by lighting candles? Is that sort of
Not
example
exactly. I mean, kind of, sort of. Another way of putting it. Trying to think of a good example. Here's a good example, right? So cooking. Cooking is prohibited according to rabbinic reading, deoraita, right? The Torah itself,
Right.
according to the way the rabbis read it, and this is where it gets confusing, because it's the way the rabbis read it, even though the Torah itself doesn't say don't cook, but the rabbis believe that the Torah says don't cook. You just have to listen carefully.
Yeah.
but they believe that when the Torah says don't cook, the Torah is saying don't cook in the conventional way that cooking happens. That's the deoraita, which means you might think, so if I create a oven that uses mirrors to focus the light of the sun, there's no fire involved, there's no natural way of cooking, it's not what would have been used for the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which is how they derived those prohibitions in the first place from the Torah, that would be okay. And the
That's
rabbi,
why some people say that microwave is fine.
that's why people say it's derabanan,
Yeah.
right? Which means that the rabbi said, you're right, the Torah never said you can't cook by solar radiant heat,
Right.
but I'm saying you can't cook by solar radiant heat. Many of the issues with regards to lights, for example, are especially now that we're moving into LED world, most, even Orthodox authorities, believe that the use of an LED is probably only, in quote, a derabanan prohibition. The incandescent, they really believed was fire, and therefore it was deoraita. It was a Torah prohibition.
Why they did this better?
Why does it matter? It matters because in certain circumstances you can be more lenient with a derabanan than you can be with a
No, why
deoraita.
the LED is different?
Oh, because LEDs have no, there's no heat, there's no consumption of a filament, there's nothing even like burning going on. It's light happening for a very different reason than something getting hot, which is what happens in incandescent. Now, I mean, as I've said, the conservative movement has a different reading of what the rabbis considered to be fire and light, and which is why the conservative movement doesn't have a problem with incandescent lights either. Of course, the environment has a problem with that, but that's another issue. But it just shows that sometimes the line between deoraita and derabanan can be difficult. Usually, it doesn't make a difference, right? If it's a regular day, regular activities happening, you don't break deoraita and you don't break derabanan. But if you have a borderline case and it's over something like this, another mitzvah, meaning the sacrifice, derabanan will get out of the way of deoraita, right? If you have something the rabbi said don't do, and then you've got the Torah saying do sacrifice, the rabbi stuff, boom, disappears. Does that make sense? But if the prohibition isn't from the rabbis, but it's also deoraita, then Torah versus Torah is a different battle, right? Torah versus rabbinic enactment, Torah always wins. Torah versus itself, then we got to discuss.
We need rabbis.
Well, yeah. Hey, we got to keep our job summary. Okay, so like I said, we're going to go through this and you'll see the logic and the style of argumentation in a way that normally you only get to see in the Talmud. So we'll take it slow. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to have to come up and for air and explain, but that's what we're on for the next few minutes. All right.
Rabbi Eliezer said, is it not logical if slaughtering, which is usually forbidden as a labor, overrides Shabbat? Shouldn't these, which are only forbidden as mandated rest, Shavut, override Shabbat? All
right, so Shavut is kind of the shorthand word for rabbinic enactments, which are meant to create a sense of rest and peace. Right? These are protections around Shabbat that, yeah, the Torah didn't say you couldn't, but we're saying you couldn't, because if you do, it's really kind of going to get Shabbat dirty and messy. It's kind of like your parents saying you have to wear nice clothes to shul, right? Okay, that maybe is the Torah commandment, dress nice for shul. The parent commandment is don't get them dirty, right? The Torah wants you to honor Shabbat. The parent wants you to keep the clothes clean, right? So they add a little protection. Then by keeping the clothes clean, you also make sure you're not playing in the mud on Shabbat, which is a problem. So there's some, they work together. But what they're saying, what Rabbi Eliezer is saying here is, okay, fine. The slaughtering, which is forbidden deoraita, right? This, you do not kill an animal on Shabbat, right? Just don't. If that is overridden because of this preparation for Passover, then shouldn't things which are of a lesser status, the rabbi prohibitions, the carrying and other things, shouldn't they also be overridden for preparation?
Because the other one you can postpone.
Okay, well, we haven't got to, well, let's make sure we understand this step. Before we get to the rebuttal, you're thinking ahead, and that's great. Rabbi Joshua loves you. Not me, Rabbi Joshua in the Mishnah. I mean, I like you too, but but you're heading the right way for the rebuttal. But I want to make sure that we understand his logic, right? So, and this is a sort of classic kal v'chomer argument, right? You go from one case to another case, and if it's true here, then surely it should be clear in something that isn't as strict normally, right? If I would break a real commandment, then certainly I should break this protectionary commandment as well. That's got some logic behind it, right? Now we're going to see there's a rebuttal going to it. Rabbi Joshua.
Rabbi Joshua said to him, "Let the festival prove this, for they permitted labor on the festival, and they forbade activities forbidden because of Shavuot."
Okay, and I said, but wait a minute, says Rabbi Joshua. On the festival itself, let's take a look at the next day. You're allowed to do all sorts of actual forbidden activities, like cooking on a festival, right? Normally on a festival, you can't cook. I mean, normally on a Shabbat, you can't cook, but on a festival, you can for the sake of the festival. But the other things which were rabbinically enacted, you still have to do those. You still have to rest. You still have to observe the rabbinic enactments. So that makes it seem like the rabbinic enactments are actually stronger than the Deoraita enactments. Did I just lose everybody?
No.
Okay, so what Rabbi Joshua is saying is flip it on its head. Sometimes, for some things, we keep the rabbinic enactments in place, even if we trump the Deoraita enactments. So you can't just say automatically, if we trump the Deoraita, that the Derabanan can also be set aside. Sometimes it's the opposite.
Because if I need to correct Rabbi
Mhm.
Yeshua say that in the festivals, okay, you are not allowed to work, but yes, you are allowed to cook. That's why.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Or right, I said that you're not supposed to do anything.
On a Shabbat, on a normal Shabbat, a normal day of rest, well, a festival is a type of day of rest, right? On a normal day of rest, on a normal holy day, we don't slaughter, we don't do that. But the Torah says, but you can for this, right? There's special dispensation, right? There's a special allowment to do that. So let me give you, let me make it clearer. It's Sukkot, right? First day of Sukkot, and it's a regular weekday, it's Sukkot. And I've got a lovely goat here that I would like to eat. If I'm going to kill the goat and eat the goat on Sukkot, I can do it. If I'm going to kill the goat and eat the goat after Sukkot, I can't. Right? So it's prohibited to kill and eat the goat unless it's for the holiday itself. Then that overrides that prohibition.
But the difference is not for me. Is very. The argument is not really serious because Shabbat is different category than festivals. So you cannot equalize Shabbat and the festival as Rabbi Joshua did.
Right. Well, so what Rabbi Joshua is doing here is saying, look, actually he is saying Shabbat and the festivals, they're the same. They're equal.
But they are not.
He's saying they start equal. And then God carves out a little corner and says, that's different. It's they start the same. Shabbat and festival are both holy days, right? They're both Kodesh. And then God says, but I'm making an exception for a few things that you can do on the festivals that you can't do on Shabbat. That's the way Rabbi Joshua is reading it. And he's saying, just because we make a distinction for these things doesn't mean the rabbinic things we also throw away. We only got special permission for this. So special permission is special permission. You can't generalize out of it. And that's his argument. I can see you're not convinced. Rabbi Eliezer isn't convinced either. Right? Rabbi Eliezer is going to say, I'm not buying it. And that's going to be part 3.
Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "What is this, Joshua? What proof is a voluntary act in respect of a commandment?"
All right. So what's his response? He says, how can you say that you can make a proof, or make evidence by this analogy? Because when you're talking about killing the goat and having the goat on Sukkot, that's your choice, right? Or having a goat after Sukkot. Okay, of course, the you can eat the goat after Sukkot, just kill it before Sukkot, that's fine, right? But that's your choice. Nobody told you you had to kill the goat and eat it. For Passover,
Yeah.
God did say you have to kill the goat and eat it.
And finish it the same
And
way.
finish it, in fact.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're gonna get to that a little bit more later. Well, maybe today. And that, he says, Rabbi Eliezer says, makes all the difference. Because since God made the commandment to do the sacrifice on the 14th, then anything connected to the commandment should be okay. And don't tell me that there are only the narrow things connected. Anything connected to the commandment is okay because it's a commandment. And don't complain about what you can do on other holidays, because it's not about can, it's about must. And because this is a must, it follows a different set of rules, right? It's the mitzvah that makes the difference, not just the exceptions. And so one set of exceptions can't inform this set of exceptions. Does that make sense? Yeah, phew, yeah. This is why the Talmud is so much fun.
Yeah.
Right? This is every page of the Talmud, is this style of arguing.
Gosh.
Okay. Part 4. New voice.
Rabbi Akiva
Yeah.
answered and said, let sprinkling purificatory waters.
Okay, the waters of purification,
Yeah.
or the waters of lustration, that wonderful Latin term. We're talking about the red heifer waters, right? So red heifer waters, these are the ashes of the red heifer mixed with water that is then sprinkled on someone who has come in contact with the dead in order to make them ritually pure so that they can, well, be considered ritually pure, to go into the temple precincts, to participate in the sacrifice, to eat from the Pesach offering, etc., etc., etc. So Rabbi Akiva is saying, I've got an analogy that can sort us out, but it's going to be an analogy based upon the waters of the red heifer. Okay? Okay.
Okay, so sprinkling the waters of purification, which is performed because it is a commandment and is forbidden only as a deoraita, a rabbinic.
Right?
Yet,
Shavut as de Rabbanan.
the Rabbanan, yeah.
Right.
Yet it does not override Shabbat. So you too do not wonder at these, that though they are required on account of a commandment and are forbidden only as Shavut, yet they do not override Shabbat.
Everyone got that? Okay. This time I want you to take a look at the explanation. It's on the next page. Right? Explanation says section 4.
Section 4.
Right. So Rabbi Akiva steps in as USCJ Rabbi puts it, and says, okay, Rabbi Joshua's argument didn't work. Oh dear. Feel sorry for Rabbi Joshua. But he says, here's the waters of the red heifer. Now we sprinkle those on a person who came into contact with the dead, right? And we do that on the 3rd and the 7th day of the purification process. Can you begin to see where we're going with this? We've got it on the 3rd day and the 7th day. That means that sometimes this is going to fall on Shabbat. So, however, if the 7th day is Shabbat, the 14th of Nisan, they are not sprinkled. Right? So let's imagine the person needs that last sprinkling in order to be ready to enjoy the Passover offering, because otherwise they're still considered ritually impure. Nevertheless, they are not sprinkled on that 7th day. Right? The prohibition of sprinkling waters, however, is only a shvut, means it's only a rabbinic prohibition. Right? It's not that the Torah says you can't, it's the rabbis created this extra barrier, this extra fence, and to say that you couldn't. And it is a mitzvah to eat the sacrifice that's going to be offered, and yet the rabbinic is trumping you from getting sprinkled, which would allow you to do the mitzvah. So that's his analogy, right? So too, the carrying of the Pesach on the shoulders and outside the borders remains prohibited, even though they are for a mitzvah, and even though it's only a rabbinic prohibition that you shouldn't do it. So we see the analogy? Right? He's saying you don't get to be sprinkled because the rabbi said so, even though by not being sprinkled, you don't get to eat the sacrifice. So just because you're doing a sacrifice and the parts of the sacrifice normally outweigh the Shabbat, doesn't mean something the rabbis did can be set aside just because you set aside the Torah thing about not slaughtering. How are we doing on the logic here?
Wow.
So this is the way it works. If you want to understand one piece of Torah, you have to understand other pieces of Torah. right? It's what's called a self-referential system, right? You can't just say, I think or I feel. You can't just say, when I was a little boy, I always liked ... You can't just come up with analogies from some random system. Well, Thomas Paine said, no. You can use the Torah to answer the Torah. You can use Judaism to answer Judaism. It has to be a self-contained system in order to generate the answers. We can use information, facts, data, that kind of stuff, like, what are sheep like, in order to answer questions. But the basic rules get answered by comparison to other rules. Make sense? All right? That way the Torah stands by itself. And that way everybody is on an equal playing field. Everyone can point to every part of the Torah, because they assume that you already know all the Torah, and use any part of it together with the rabbinic analysis as a proof or an analogy or a help to answer any other part. Remember way back at the beginning, in our first brachot class, I said one of the most empowering things about the Mishnah is that the Mishnah assumes you know every other part of Torah and every other part of rabbinic teaching except for the one page you're currently looking at. And the most frustrating thing about the Mishnah is it assumes that you know every other part of the Torah and every other part of the rabbinic teaching except for the page you're looking at. So you have to know everything before you can know anything. And that's why you study it as a group. That's why you don't just sit down and open the Mishnah and expect to understand it. Because you have to have lots of people who each add commentary and analysis to put it all together. Because it's too big to just learn on your own. You'll choke. Okay.
All right.
So Rabbi Eliezer is going to...
That's very interesting that Rabbi Akiva answered to his teacher. Like, it's not a lack of respect.
So when there is a case where it is logic, then it's all bets are off. Well, not all bets are off. You still have to be respectful, right? But if someone is saying, it appears to me that the logic says ... then logic is open for other people to bring logic. Okay. If someone says, I have a tradition, it was taught to me by my teacher, ...
Okay.
You're stuck with your teacher, right? Your teacher has taught you, and that's what you go with.
So that's why, because it's logic, Rabbi Akiva can go against Rabbi Eliezer.
Exactly. Right. So if I'm very sorry, Master, but your logic doesn't work because we have another analogy of something that's comparable, and in there the rules fit what all the other sages are saying. And by the way, you'll notice that basically all the other sages are on one side, and Rabbi Eliezer is on the minority opinion, the minority of one. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer, however, is not done. He's not given up.
Rabbi Eliezer said to him, but in respect of that, I am arguing, if slaughtering, which is a labor, overrides Shabbat, is it not logical that sprinkling, which is only a shavut,
right, a rabbinic
thing, should override Shabbat?
All right, so basically Rabbi Eliezer answers by doubling down.
Yeah.
Right, he basically says, you know what, you're right, Akiva, sprinkling should be okay.
Yeah.
Rather than using the non-sprinkling as proof for the non-carrying, Rabbi Eliezer basically says, you know what, you're right. The non-sprinkling doesn't make sense either. We should be able to sprinkle because that's only a shvut, and therefore the Deoraita should trump it.
And also has the same logic of the sacrifice of Passover. There's a day, a specific day that you need to do the mitzvah. You must do it on that day. And if the 7 days on Shabbat, but you must do, is the same logic of the sacrifice, so you need to sprinkle.
Okay, so you're Rabbi Eliezer man.
Yeah. No, for me the same logic.
Yeah, of course.
In both situations.
So it is the same logic. There are a couple differences which I can just add. One, the most important is that there technically is another day for the sacrifice. Right,
okay,
it's Pesach Sheni, 1 month later, yes. Right? You get a second Passover. Most people do not observe this exactly nowadays, but in the old days when it came time for the sacrifice, let's imagine you were impure, no sprinkling was possible for, it happened too recently, etc., or you're just on a boat and the boat gets delayed. You have a month that you could do it later. right? So technically there is a way to make up the Passover sacrifice for 1 month later. But what Rabbi Eliezer is basically saying here is that he disagrees with the rabbis on that too, right? So you can't use that analogy to defeat me, because actually I disagree with that law, therefore that law won't convince me. Does that make sense? Right? It'd be like trying to say to somebody, I think that the speed limit should be changed because after all, we have laws that control how fast you can ride your bicycle, right? And if you have to restrict how fast you can ride your bicycle, a car is more dangerous. You should certainly have to restrict how fast you can drive a car. And the person you're arguing with says, actually, I don't think we should have laws on bicycles either. Okay, so I guess we'll have to find a new argument that we can use to convince you. Make sense? Okay. Part 6. Yes.
Rabbi Akiva said to him, or the opposite, if sprinkling, which is forbidden as a rabbinic thing, does not override Shabbat, then slaughtering, which is normally forbidden on account of labor, is it not logical that it should not override Shabbat?
Okay, so you have to understand that Akiva is arguing rhetorically here. Right? He's not trying to make a real claim, but he's basically saying, look, Eliezer, two can play this game and we can go both ways. You know, just because you don't like the way one law is implication, I can flip it around and say, well, you know, if the purification we're not allowed to do, and that's only a shvut, then the slaughter itself of the Passover sacrifice we shouldn't be allowing. But we do, and we don't. So guess what? Sometimes there are things that by your logic are going to look inconsistent, but deal with it. Because there is a good reason why we do and why we don't. And that's his rebuttal. Is that you can't just say, well, I don't think we should do that either, because I can stand over here and say, well, I don't think we should do that either. And then we're not moving anywhere. If you're going to argue against an analogy by claiming that the half of the analogy that currently is not under discussion shouldn't be the law, but it is the accepted law of the sages, then you're not playing fair. Because we have to have some common ground. Right? We have to share certain basic understandings of the subject and laws in order for us to argue about it. If we don't share that basic understanding, then it's you have your interpretation, I have my interpretation, and we're not going to be celebrating Passover together. And that's kind of what Rabbi Akiva's rhetorical response is. It's like, if we're just going to be turning over, if we're going to be flipping laws the way we want, then I can flip a law too, and then your analogy falls apart. So why don't we keep the other laws and for another time, and let's deal with this one. Okay? Yeah.
So Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, you are uprooting what is written in the Torah, which is, at twilight, offer it at its set time, both on weekdays and on Shabbat.
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer responds and says, no, I know what you're trying to do, but it's totally different, because this sacrifice, this overriding, is a commandment telling us to override. And so you don't get to make me feel bad about flipping laws, because no one's going to say we're going to flip this law, right? Because this law is not just we're doing it because we want to do it. This law is its own separate commandment, and nobody is going to flip that from the Torah. So nice try, Akiva, but I'm not backing down. Make sense? Okay. Number 7.
He said to him, Akiva.
Oh, sorry, no, we're on
8.
8.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, he said to him.
That's Akiva saying back.
Back to Eliezer, Master, give me an appointed time for these, as there is an appointed season for slaughtering.
All right, so he goes back to the original point, right? That the Torah says that there is a mandated time for the slaughter, right? And that is the reason why we are overriding it. There isn't an appointed time for carrying, right? So he kind of moved Eliezer into a corner and not exactly trapped him, but logically showed, look, you're saying I'm not allowed to flip the law like you were flipping the law, because the law I'm flipping is actually a separate mitzvah. But it's a separate mitzvah. It's a separate mitzvah. Therefore, it does get special treatment. And the rabbinic ones, which are not part of the separate mitzvah, don't get overridden. So he's basically saying, thank you for emphasizing that this has special status, the slaughter has special status because it's its own commandment. And because it's its special status, because it's its own command, it is its own commandment. Because it has that special status, you can't apply the logic that since we overrule it, we can overrule non-special status commandment things, right? Like the carrying that is a rabbinic commandment, right? We're only overriding Shabbat for this one because it's so special. We can't override other things, even that seem less important or to have a lower status. We just don't override Shabbat because we feel that we've already gone halfway, we might as well do the rest. We only override Shabbat when there is the most precise permission, or in this case, requirement, that we override Shabbat. In fact, really, I guess by definition, you never override Shabbat unless it's a requirement. Saving a life is a requirement. It's not permission. You are required to save the life. And that's what he's basically saying. And the things that are not required, like carrying the animal or cooking it early, that's not required on Shabbat. The mitzvah doesn't say cook it on the 14th. The mitzvah just says eat it on the 15th. So guess what, Rabbi Eliezer, my master, as Rabbi Akiva puts it, that your logic falls apart, right? We get a narrow permission only because of the things that are so precisely linked to this time. And that means the other things, which even are a lesser status, you don't get permission on. Make sense?
Sure.
Go Akiva.
So, and this end does make sense. Rabbi Akiva stated a general rule: work which could be done on the eve of Shabbat does not override Shabbat. Slaughtering which could not be done on the eve of Shabbat does override Shabbat.
Right, and so this is a general rule that is used in other places in the Mishnah and Talmud as well, which is basically if there is a commandment that you must do something on a day, and that day happens to be Shabbat, and there's no other way you could have done it except on that day at that time, then yes, that commandment will override Shabbat. But if there's any other way that it could have been done before or after Shabbat, you don't do it on Shabbat, right? If you could have done it at a different time, then you don't get permission to trump Shabbat. Make sense? Makes sense. Phew. Your brain, all your brain juices moving, right? Right. So that is like I said, it's a lot of fun because it's a good example of how the debates in the Talmud work. Okay, let's go for it. Let's see if we can do a little bit more. Okay, because we still got 10 minutes, and yeah, we started a little late, so I don't want to cut ourselves short. But the next Mishnah is connected to Mishnah 3 and 4 are very closely connected. But to get to it, we got to get a little more introduction. All right, we're going to talk about the Chagiga. Now, the Chagiga in the rabbinic mind is the bonus animal. You're all looking at me like, what are you talking about? Okay, so imagine you're having your Seder, and you've got a lamb. And remember, it's a very particular lamb. It has to be just the right age. It has to be male. It has to be no blemishes at all. Right? 1 year.
1 year.
Yeah. Right. So it's very, very specific. And a 1-year-old lamb is not exactly huge, and there aren't tons of them everywhere. So what happens if there isn't enough lamb really for everybody? Aren't you going to be hungry?
Yeah, you can't do that.
Right? So what else are you supposed to be eating?
Hey,
Matzah.
Yerushamame, exactly. Right? And so the rabbis look at the verse, and this, I'll refer you up to the introduction. The verse in Deuteronomy 16:2 says, you'll slaughter the Pesach offering for your God from the flock and the herd. Right? And herd here means cows. And so obviously we don't do the Passover offering, the actual Passover offering, the Pesach, from a cow. So what could this cow be? The rabbis say this cow is the Chagiga. This is the cow you slaughter as a type of sacrifice in order that you will eat it as bonus meat along with the lamb if you don't have enough lamb. All right, so let's imagine your little town, your courtyard has a lamb, and it's this scrawny little thing, and there's barely going to be enough for, you know, a couple bites for everybody. What else are you going to eat? You know, just vegetables? It's a chag. You're supposed to be celebrating. So you get a chagiga, and it comes from the same word as chag, for the festival. You take a cow, you kill the cow, now you've got plenty of meat. And now when you're eating the sacrifice, you'll be eating it on a nice, full, happy stomach. Right?
Chagiga must be only a cow, could be any.
No, it can be other things as well. They're going to go into that in a bit. Yeah.
Also.
Yeah, but that's what we're talking about. Okay, makes sense? We got the groundwork down?
Yeah, it's like anything so that you can fill your stomach. So then when you come to the Pesach, you can actually appreciate it instead of being so hungry that you gobble it right down. And don't
Exactly right.
appreciate
Exactly. And also don't feel satisfied.
it, Don't feel
I
satisfied.
mean, you're supposed to
That's
be
right.
happy at Passover, not
Right.
that's it. Yeah, keep chewing, that's all you get. It's exactly, it's supposed to be a festival. And yes, even as far back as 2000 and some odd years ago, we knew that happiness came with this. Right? We're not opposed to the stomach. You know, sometimes our stomachs oppose us, but we're not upset about the idea that food and the physical should be part of our joy. Absolutely, and embrace the physical. You just don't overdo it. Which is going to come into our question of, well, when do you, don't you?
When does he bring a chagiga with it, with the Pesach sacrifice?
Right, which
When?
is meaning, okay, we're going to still have this latent question here of, okay, so I'm bringing my Passover, which I have to bring because of the commandment. The chagiga is kind of a bonus bring.
Mhm.
So when do I get to bring it?
For me, it's clear you need to prepare this the 13th.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and see what the Mishnah says, but you're thinking along the right lines.
So when the Hag comes during the week, he brings with it in purity and in small amounts.
Right? So what these three things are saying is, okay, it's during the week, meaning not the Shabbat, right? It's impurity, meaning you're ritually pure, right? Because if you're not ritually pure, you're not eating the Pesach, and if you're not eating the Pesach, you don't get to eat the cow, right? Because the cow is secondary, it's attached. That looks weird. The cow is attached to the sheep. It is dependent. There we go. It depends on the presence of the Passover sacrifice. If you're not having the Passover sacrifice because you're ritually impure, you don't get to have the chagiga because it's dependent on the other. You remove the lamb, cow goes with it. Make sense? And in small amounts, what they're trying to say here is if there isn't enough lamb to go around, because the opposite is the next part.
When it comes on Shabbat, in large amounts and in impurity, one does not bring the chagiga with it.
Okay, so if you've got tons of lamb, right, just the biggest, fattest, most wonderful lamb ever, or maybe it's just you and two other people that are going to be eating this, so there's no worry of shortage, then you don't need a chagiga.
So you need to decide the 13th if you have or not enough meat.
Do you not decide what you're serving for your Seder until the day before?
His wife decides.
We are already in negotiation for the Seder now.
Exactly right.
We started
How
last
many
week.
people are we going to invite, and where are we going to?
Started last week
Yeah.
already.
Exactly. And you'll be putting your shopping list together soon, I'm sure, and what the menu will be, right? So that's
Yeah, we are very close. Like I need to invite and to organize everything.
because other people will. I mean, especially if you're inviting people, you want to make sure that they know they can come to your house. They don't have to find somewhere else.
Mhm.
Okay, so exactly. Even back then, they also needed to plan ahead. And if they knew they weren't going to have enough meat straight from the Pesach, they would arrange to have the chagiga as well. But if they knew they had enough, even if they might want to have the bonus, no. Because the focus is the Pesach sacrifice itself. Right? So the chagiga is there as a supplement. If you don't need the supplement, you don't need the supplement. It's kind of like your doctor would tell you. If you're getting all of your vitamins and minerals and everything, or your calories through your regular dinner and lunch and breakfast, you don't need to take extra vitamin pills. You don't need to take, extra protein shakes. If you get your daily dose through natural food and all of that, you don't need the bonus stuff. In fact, generally they argue you probably shouldn't get it. You know, if you get your normal vitamins the way you should be getting them, you don't need supplements. Same here. If you get your meat through the Pesach, you don't need the Chagiga. Make sense? Makes sense. Oh, it's so logical. Okay, I think we got just enough time because it's really, really short for Mishnah 4.
Mishnah 4. The Hagigah was brought of flocks, herds, lambs or goats, of the males or the females.
So obviously we can see much bigger selection.
Yeah, wait.
Because the sacrifice is only a man.
Right, the Passover sacrifice. Yeah, exactly. And only sheep and only 1 year. It's
1 year.
very narrow. Yeah.
Oh, the Hagigah.
But the Chagiga, well, this is the whole point. If your only reason we're bringing the Chagiga is because we may not have access to enough meat from the lamb, then you better make sure that you can get something for the Chagiga. I mean, it's just there better be lots of options.
And it is eaten 2 days and 1 night.
Right. And again, we sort of mentioned in passing, but the rabbis assume you already know that you only eat the Passover sacrifice until midnight.
Mhm.
Right?
Right.
You start your Seder, and by midnight, the Passover sacrifice is done. But this, no, you got 2 days in the night that you can eat, right? It's Tupperware is okay. Right? You can eat, you can eat this for a longer period of time. Make sense?
Mhm.
Makes sense. Trying to remember, no, we don't have time to go on because we got another good logic puzzle. So we're going to stop there. But we're going to do another Rabbi Joshua and Eliezer argument when we take it up next week. So make sure you come in with a nice warmed up brain.
My gosh.
Okay? Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Yeshua.
Wow.